91 Days is a lot of things. It's a story about familial love, ambition, greed, betrayal, conviction, internal conflict, and ultimately revenge. But predictable it is not. Angelo Lagusa is our protagonist who goes through the pain of losing his family at a young age. And that's because they all get murdered in front of his eyes. He definitely did survive that night, but his will to live surely did not. Since then, all this guy has done is listlessly spend his living moments away, surviving as an empty husk. That is, until the day he receives a letter. A letter that lights a fire within him. One that tells him where to direct the hatred that's slowly but surely been festering within him all this time. The Vanetti. They are the people who destroyed his life, and now it's time for Angelo, henceforth gonna be referred to as Avilio, to pay them back several fold. And that's exactly where the second main character of the show comes into the picture. Nero Vanetti. Nero is the charismatic scion of the Vanetti family. He's the brash guy who does what he likes and is carefree for the most part. But the one thing that he values above all is the pride of his family. The Vanetti family. All of his actions are dictated by his personal code of placing the family before everything else. As long as it helps uphold the family name, nothing is off limits. This is a story about Avilio's revenge. But it is also a story about Nero and his core principle of placing the Vanetti name above all. As such, while we do see the story through Avilio's eyes for the most part, Nero also acts as a second protagonist throughout the rest of the series. 91 Days, when you boil it down, is the story of how the fates of these two young men intertwine to create an interesting yet brutal crime drama set in the Prohibition Era of the 1930s, where booze is gold and violent mafia clashes are the norm. The Vanettis, the Orcos, and the Galicias are the big mafia families in this story. And most of the revenge plot here is centered not just around the two primary characters, but also the internal politics between these three big powers. But yeah, I call 91 Days interesting because it isn't often that you get anime set in a specific time period, let alone stick to realism and be free of any kind of supernatural influence. There's a general lack of typical Japanese anime humor here and a complete lack of any kind of fan service. And that really makes this a breath of fresh air compared to most series out there. This series sticks to its guns completely and very strictly adhering to realism as much as it possibly can throughout the entirety of its run. Well, except one character. But I think we can focus on him when we get to discussing the character specifically. Anyway, getting back to the story, I would say that the overall story, in my opinion, is pretty damn good. Due to the combination of the setting and the character's ambitions, that stem from multiple factors like familial love, greed, and revenge, death isn't really uncommon in this story. But death certainly is not meaningless here. The anime manages to do a really good job of getting us acquainted with the state of mind of its characters. That is, by having us know and understand what makes them tick, what really matters to them, and so on. It's precisely because of this that a lot of those deaths that you see over the course of the series actually become a lot more impactful than they would usually be. With that said, let's move on to discussing the characters. The two main characters, Avilio and Nero, are fleshed out relatively well. They live and die for their ideals and can do anything for it. We have pretty much already established that. But what about the rest of the cast? Are they given the kind of care in their writing that these two here did? Thankfully, the answer is a resounding yes for most of the important ones. Corteo, for example, who's Avilio's childhood friend, is a complete 180-degree shift from Avilio at first glance. He's not assertive. He doesn't seem to have a knack for coming up with manipulative plans like his buddy does, nor does he seem like he has any conviction that drives him as a person. But as the story goes on, you get to see more of him. And when the time really comes for his character to shine, he makes it clear that he's not a prop for the other characters. He has his own moral code and reasons that drive him. That is really what makes his character realistic. And this really holds true for a large majority of the remainder of the cast. Except one. Okay, let's talk about him. Fango. Fango is an anomaly. I personally feel like he doesn't really gel well with the rest of the world of 91 Days for being a bit too cray-cray. You could always chalk it up as, him being one of the psychopaths from among the Prohibition Era society, which he most definitely is, but he still feels relatively out of place among the rest of the cast. He just feels more like your average crazy anime guy who has been put in there just to spice things up a bit and add a layer of unpredictability to the plot. Do not get me wrong though, I'm not really complaining. His voice actor, Kenjiro Suda, does such a terrific job at voicing him that I just can't help but think Fango as a whole was an asset to the show rather than acting like a detrimental factor. But I kinda had to bring him up, because he's just that fucking crazy.
この酒は運んできたんだ。どこから？あっちからだ。正直もんじゃねえが、ボーイ。もう一度聞くぜ。この酒はどうした？
I think with that though, that kind of more or less sums up what I had to say about the cast. But that out of the way, let's talk production values and voice acting. 91 Days started off looking really good. I was actually really surprised by how sharp the visuals were and how the characters almost always stayed on model. But as is the case with a lot of anime out there, the series dips a bit in quality of its art and animation and never really recovers. Not to the heights that it established in terms of its visuals in the initial episodes anyway. That's not to say that it ever looks ugly, but just not as consistently beautiful as it did before. Studio Shuka, nevertheless in my eyes, deserves props for delivering for the most part. As for the soundtrack, I'm not sure if there's anything that really stuck with me after finishing it, with probably the exception of the main theme. But whether or not you can listen to the soundtrack on its own, separate from the series, that is something I consider to just be a bonus. What matters here the most is whether or not it complements the show. And that is something 91 Days OST manages to excel at. I have to give the composer, Shogo Kaida, massive props for coming up with a soundtrack that really fits the tone and setting of the show to a T. And not just the soundtrack, the audio engineering in general here is fucking exceptional. There are many scenes that have stuck around in my head since I finished it, and most of them can be attributed to exceptional choice of music and really good mixing on the sound effects. Definitely a job well done in my opinion. Also, before I move on to the conclusion, I would really like to bring notice to the exceptional voice acting in this anime. Almost everyone's performance is excellent here, but the voice actors for Nero, Avilio and Fango are exceptional. Fango in general is the best, but that's hands down. I don't think anybody who has watched 91 Days would actually debate with me over this. But Nero's and Avilio's voice acting work in the final batch of episodes was something else. 91 Days is a really good anime. It's a tragic story that primarily deals with this one single question: whether revenge can really be the sole sustainable reason for the existence of a person. It reaches that answer by presenting us with the story of two characters who parallel each other a lot, but whose reason for existence lie at the opposite ends of the spectrum. One seeks to protect, while the other seeks to destroy. Whether or not you agree with the answer that it presents you with, you gotta admit that it does a damn fine job at telling its story and presenting its ideas to you. It does that with little to no problems in its pacing, while looking and sounding really good for the most part. And for that, I believe 91 Days definitely deserves your attention. But yeah, that said, this is VClyfe. Like, share and subscribe if you like my content, and peace out, I guess.